I'm standing in what used to be a prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma. The barracks are long gone. The fences have been removed. The guard towers torn down decades ago. Now it's just an empty field with a historical marker that most people drive past without noticing. But if you know what to look for, you can still see traces, the foundations of buildings, the outline of the parade ground, the remains of a baseball diamond. This was Camp Alva. Between 1943 and 1946, it held over 3,000 German prisoners of war, and among those prisoners were boys, children, some as young as 14, kids who'd been handed rifles and told to fight for the Third Reich. What happened to those boys here changed some of their lives forever, because Camp Alva wasn't just a prison, it was a school, an experiment, an attempt to take children who'd been raised to believe in Hitler and transform them into something else. I'm here to tell you that story, the story of America's re-education camps for child prisoners of war, a story that's been largely forgotten, a story that raises questions we still struggle with today. What do you do with child soldiers? How do you deprogram kids who've been indoctrinated from birth? Can education reverse years of propaganda? And who gets to decide what re-education means? Let me show you what I found. To understand the re-education camps, you first need to understand who these children were and how they ended up as prisoners of war in America. I'm looking at a photograph from 1945. It shows a group of German POWs who've just arrived at an American camp. Most are adults, but in the back row there's a boy. He looks about 15, maybe 16. It's hard to tell because he's so thin. His name was recorded as Werner Hessler, age 16, captured in France in August 1944, member of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth Division. Werner was one of thousands of teenagers who fought in the final years of World War II, and he was one of hundreds who ended up as POWs in America. Let me explain how this happened. By 1943, Germany was losing the war. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder consuming entire divisions. The Western Allies were preparing to invade Europe. Germany needed soldiers desperately, so they turned to children. The Hitler Youth had been preparing boys for war since 1933. From age 10, German boys were enrolled in the Jungvolk. They learned to march, to shoot, to obey orders without question. At 14, they moved up to the Hitler Youth proper. More military training, more indoctrination, more preparation for war. By age 18, they were supposed to join the Wehrmacht, but as casualties mounted, that age dropped. First to then 16. By 1945, 14-year-olds were being drafted. Some were sent to the Eastern Front, some defended German cities, and some ended up in France, fighting against American and British forces. I spoke with Dr. Richard Hoffman, a historian who spent 30 years studying German child soldiers. He showed me records from American POW camps that documented ages. We found boys as young as 14 in American custody, he told me. Some lied about their age, claiming to be 18 or 19, but medical examinations revealed the truth. They were children. The youngest documented German POW in America was 13 years old. 13. He'd lied about his age to join the Wehrmacht because his 3 older brothers had already been killed. He wanted to avenge them. He was captured 2 weeks after reaching the front. He spent the next 2 years in a POW camp in Texas. When American soldiers first started capturing teenage German prisoners, they didn't know what to do with them. The Geneva Convention had rules about prisoners of war, but it didn't really address child soldiers. Were these boys prisoners or victims? Should they be imprisoned or protected? I found a memo from 1944 in the National Archives. It's from a camp commander to the War Department. He writes, "We have approximately 200 prisoners under age 18. Many appear to be 15, 16 years old. They are frightened, malnourished, and clearly traumatized. Request guidance on proper handling." The response took 3 weeks. During that time, those boys were held with adult prisoners. They were subjected to the same treatment. the same routines, the same rules. But some camp commanders realized this wasn't working. These weren't hardened soldiers. They were kids who'd been brainwashed. And that's when the idea of re-education camps was born. I'm in Washington, D.C. at the National Archive. In front of me are documents from something called the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office. This was the department responsible for prisoner of war operations. In these files I found the blueprint for America's re-education program for German POWs. The architect was a man named Edward Davison. He was a professor before the war, British-born, educated at Cambridge, an expert in German literature and culture. In 1943 he was recruited by the War Department to design a program that could denazify German prisoners. His proposal was radical. Instead of just imprisoning German POWs, America should educate them, show them democracy, expose them to ideas the Nazis had suppressed, turn enemies into potential allies. The program had a name, intellectual diversion. That's what they called it officially. But everyone involved knew it was re-education. Here's what I found fascinating. Davison specifically argued that young prisoners should be the primary focus. His reasoning was simple. Adults who'd been Nazis for 20 years were unlikely to change, but kids who'd been raised under Hitler but weren't fully formed adults, they could be reached. I found a letter Davison wrote the War Department in 1944. The boys we are receiving now have known nothing but National Socialism. They believe Hitler is a hero. They believe democracy is weak. They believe Germans are superior to all other races. These beliefs were not chosen. They were imposed from childhood. If we can show these young prisoners a different way of thinking, we may not only win the war but also win the peace. The War Department approved his proposal, and in 1944 the re-education program began. Not all POW camps participated. The program focused on camps with significant numbers of younger prisoners: Camp Alva in Oklahoma, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Fort Eustis in Virginia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and several others. I traveled to all of these locations. In each place, I tried to find traces of what happened there. At Camp Concordia, I met Robert Miller. He's 94 years old. In 1944, he was a young guard at the camp. He remembers when the re-education program started. They brought in teachers, he told me, college professors, people who spoke German. They set up classrooms right there in the barracks. I thought it was crazy at first. Why are we teaching Nazis? But Miller said his perspective changed when he saw the young prisoners up close. Some of them were just kids, scared, confused. They'd been told Americans were monsters. When we didn't beat them or starve them, they didn't know what to think. The re-education program, it wasn't about being nice to enemies, it was about showing them the truth. So what did this re-education actually look like? I'm holding a curriculum guide from 1944. It's titled Democracy in Practice, an educational program for German prisoners of war. It's a remarkable document. It outlines exactly what America wanted to teach German POWs, especially the young ones. The program had several components. Component 1. American history and civics. Young German POWs were taught about the American Revolution, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, how democracy works, why individual freedom matters. This wasn't subtle propaganda, it was direct education about democratic principles. I found testimonies from German POWs who went through this program. One, who was 16 when captured, wrote years later, "We learned about Thomas Jefferson, about checks and balances, about freedom of speech. These concepts were completely foreign to us. In Germany, we'd learned that strong leadership meant one man making all decisions, that questioning authority was weakness. The American system seemed chaotic, but the more we learned, the more it made sense." Component 2. Literature and art. German POWs were given access to books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, works by Jewish authors, books about democracy, novels that presented perspectives Nazis had suppressed. They attended film screenings, not just Hollywood entertainment, but documentaries about American life, newsreels showing the liberation of concentration camps, footage the Nazis had denied existed. I spoke with Dr. Elena Schmidt, a cultural historian, about this component. The Nazis had created a completely controlled information environment, she explained. German children in the 1940s had never been exposed to alternative viewpoints. The re-education program deliberately flooded them with information, books, films, newspapers. It was an attempt to break through the propaganda wall. Component 3: Discussion and debate. This was the most controversial part. Young POWs were encouraged to ask questions, to debate ideas, to challenge what they'd been taught. American instructors would pose questions. Why do you believe Germans are superior? How do you know what you've been told about Jews is true? What evidence do you have that democracy doesn't work? The goal wasn't to lecture. It was to make these young prisoners think critically. Many had never been allowed to question anything before. I found an instructor's report from Camp Alva in 1945. It describes a discussion group with teenage POWs. Ask them to define democracy. Initial responses focused on weakness and disorder, clearly reflecting Nazi teaching. But after 2 hours of discussion, several boys began questioning their assumptions. One prisoner, age 17, said, "We were told democracy means chaos. But this camp is run democratically and it's more organized than my unit in Germany ever was." This was a breakthrough moment. Component 4: Practical democracy. POWs were allowed to form their own camp governance. They elected representatives. They created their own recreation programs. They ran their own libraries and newspapers. For many young prisoners, this was the first time they'd participated in any kind of democratic process. The first time their vote had mattered. The first time they'd chosen their own leaders. Robert Miller, the guard I interviewed, remembered this clearly. They elected a camp spokesman. He was only 19 years old, but he'd give speeches to the other prisoners about cooperation and self-governance. It was like watching democracy in miniature. But here's the thing. Not all German POWs wanted to be re-educated. I need to be honest about something. The re-education program didn't work on everyone, and it created serious problems within POW camps. Hardcore Nazi prisoners, including some teenagers who were true believers, resisted the program. They saw it as American brainwashing, as propaganda no different from what they'd received in Germany. These prisoners enforced a code of silence. POWs who participated too enthusiastically in re-education were labeled traitors, collaborators, enemies of Germany, and they were punished. I found records of violence within POW camps, Germans attacking other Germans, beatings, intimidation, in some cases, murder. The most demonstrated case happened at Camp Tunkawa in Oklahoma in 1943. A German POW named Johannes Kunze was suspected of informing to American guards. He was beaten to death by fellow prisoners. 7 German POWs were tried for his murder. 5 were executed. This happened in America. Germans killing Germans over perceived collaboration with Americans. This violence created a terrible dilemma for young POWs. If they participated in re-education, they risked being targeted by Nazi hardliners. If they didn't participate, they missed the opportunity to learn. Camp authorities tried to separate prisoners by ideology. They created anti-Nazi camps, where prisoners who rejected Nazi ideology could be housed safely, and hardcore camps where committed Nazis were isolated. But determining who belonged where was difficult, especially with teenagers. I spoke with Dr. Hoffman about this challenge. A 15-year-old German soldier, is he a committed Nazi or a brainwashed child? How do you tell the difference? Some teenagers were fanatics who'd volunteer information about other prisoners who criticized Hitler. Others were just scared kids parroting what they'd been taught because they didn't know anything else. The solution was imperfect. Young prisoners were generally assumed to be salvageable, unless they demonstrated extreme Nazi commitment. They were placed in moderate camps where re-education was encouraged but not forced. This brings up an uncomfortable question. Was re-education voluntary or mandatory? Officially, it was voluntary or mandatory. Officially, it was voluntary. POWs couldn't be forced to attend classes or discussion groups. The Geneva Convention prohibited that kind of coercion, but in practice, the line was blurry. POWs who participated in re-education programs received privileges, better work assignments, access to recreation programs, more opportunities to earn money. Those who refused, they didn't lose basic rights. But they also didn't gain extras. One German POW, interviewed decades later, put it bluntly, it wasn't forced. But if you wanted a better life in the camp, you participated. It was coercion through incentive. Is that ethical? Is it okay to incentivize people to change their beliefs? I don't have a simple answer, and I don't think anyone involved at the time did either. What I can tell you is what happened to some of the boys who went through the program. I'm reading a letter written it's from a German POW to his mother in Germany. He was 17 when captured. 19 when he wrote this letter. Mother, I know you won't understand this, but I can't come back to Germany and pretend nothing has changed. I've learned things here, about what our country did, about the camps, about the murders, about the lies we were told. I don't hate Germany. I don't hate you. But I can't be the person I was when I left. That person believed things that weren't true. That person would have died for a lie. The Americans didn't brainwash me. They just showed me facts I'd never been allowed to see. And now I have to figure out what to do with those facts. This letter represents what the re-education program aimed for. Not creating Americans out of Germans, but creating Germans who could think critically about what their country had done. Let me tell you about specific boys whose lives were changed. Karl Schneider was 16 when captured in France in 1944. He'd been in the Hitler Youth since age 10. He believed completely in Nazi ideology. When he arrived at Camp Concordia, he refused to speak to American guards. He sat in the back of classrooms with his arms crossed. But the instructors didn't give up. They gave him books. They invited him to film screenings. They didn't argue with him. They just exposed him to information. After 3 months, Schneider asked a question during a discussion group. Just one question. How do we know the concentration camp films aren't propaganda? The instructor's response was brilliant. He said, "That's a great question. How would we know? What evidence would convince you either way?" This started Schneider on a path of inquiry. He began reading, watching, questioning. Not because Americans forced him to, but because he wanted to understand. By the time he was repatriated to Germany in 1946, Schneider had completely rejected Nazi ideology. He became a teacher in West Germany. He spent his career teaching young Germans to think critically, to question authority, to demand evidence. I tried to find Schneider. He died in 2003, but I found his son, who told me, "My father never stopped talking about his time in America. He said it saved his life. Not physically, he wasn't being executed, but intellectually. He said American re-education taught him how to think, not what to think." Hans Müller was 15 when captured. Unlike Schneider, Müller wasn't a true believer. He'd been drafted. He didn't particularly believe in Hitler, but he didn't know anything else. At Camp Alva, Müller discovered something he'd never experienced: choice. He could choose what books to read, what classes to attend, what activities to participate in. This was revolutionary for a boy who'd been told what to do every day of his life since age 10. Müller thrived in the re-education environment. He learned English, he read voraciously. He participated in camp democracy. He discovered that he liked learning. After repatriation, Müller managed to immigrate to America in 1952. He became a US citizen. He got a college degree, something that would have been impossible for him in Nazi Germany, given his working-class background. I found Müller in California. He's 94 now. When I asked him about his time in the POW camp, he said something that stuck with me. People ask if I was angry about being imprisoned. I tell them I was never freer than when I was a prisoner in America. For the first time in my life, I could think my own thoughts, form my own opinions, choose my own path. The re-education program didn't make me American. It made me myself. But not every story was positive. Fritz Weber was 14 when captured, the youngest in his camp. He was so young that American authorities debated whether he should be in a POW camp at all, or transferred to some kind of youth facility. They kept him in the camp, but placed him in the re-education program immediately. They thought his age made him particularly malleable, particularly salvageable. They were wrong. Weber resisted every aspect of re-education. He remained a committed Nazi throughout his imprisonment. He believed the concentration camp footage was faked. He believed Jews had deserved whatever happened to them. He believed Germany would still somehow win the war. When he was repatriated in 1946, he immediately joined neo-Nazi groups forming in post-war Germany. He spent his life trying to rehabilitate Hitler's image. I tried to interview Weber. He refused. His family told me he's never spoken about his time as a POW except to say, "The Americans tried to break me, they failed." His story is a reminder that re-education didn't work on everyone, that some people were too committed to their beliefs to change. That ideology can't always be overcome with education. But here's what I found interesting. For every Fritz Weber there were 5 or 6 Karl Schneiders and Hans Müllers, boys whose perspectives were changed, who rejected Nazi ideology, who became advocates for democracy. The question is, was it worth it? I'm sitting across from Dr. Margaret Chen. She's an ethicist who specializes in questions of coercion, education, and consent. I wanted to ask her about the moral implications of the re-education program. So America took prisoners of war, some of them children, and deliberately tried to change what they believed. I said, "Is that ethical?" She thought for a long moment. That's a hard question. On one hand, these boys had been indoctrinated into an ideology that led to genocide. Changing those beliefs seems like a moral good. On the other hand, systematically changing someone's beliefs while they're imprisoned, that's ethically complicated. Where's the line between education and indoctrination? I asked. Intent and method, she said. Indoctrination means forcing people to accept ideas without critical thinking. Education means teaching people how to think critically and letting them reach their own conclusions. If the re-education program taught critical thinking and exposed POWs to diverse information, that's education. If it forced specific conclusions, that's indoctrination. Based on everything I've found, the re-education program was closer to education than indoctrination. It emphasized critical thinking. It encouraged questions. It exposed POWs to multiple perspectives. But it also had a specific goal: to make German POWs reject Nazism. So the line was blurry. I posed another question to Dr. Chen. What about the age factor? These were children. Does that change the ethics? Absolutely, she said immediately. Children are more vulnerable to influence. That makes the ethical responsibility greater. You could argue that children who'd been indoctrinated by Nazis needed intervention, or you could argue that re-educating children while they're imprisoned is exploitation. Again, no easy answer. I also spoke with veterans groups, American veterans who'd fought against Germany. I wanted to know how they felt about the re-education program. The responses were mixed. Some veterans supported it. We weren't just fighting Germany, one told me. We were fighting an idea, Nazism. If we could kill that idea in German prisoners' minds, we accomplished more than killing those prisoners would have. Others were angry. We're teaching them, we're giving them college courses, while our guys were rotting in German POW camps. That's outrageous. Both perspectives are valid. Both reflect real moral positions. I'll tell you what I think. After spending months researching this, the re-education program was imperfect. It was ethically complicated. It didn't work on everyone. It was expensive and controversial. But for boys like Karl Schneider and Hans Müller, it was transformative. It gave them tools to think for themselves. It exposed them to truth they'd been denied. It helped them become people they couldn't have become under Nazi ideology. Was it worth it? I think for those boys, yes. For the larger strategic goal of denazifying Germany and building a democratic ally, the effects were mixed but generally positive. But I can also understand why it made people uncomfortable, both then and now. By 1946, the war was over. Germany had surrendered. The question now was, what do we do with all these German POWs? Repatriation began slowly. The first to go back were older prisoners, then younger ones. By 1947, most German POWs had been returned to Germany. But returning to Germany in 1947 was returning to ruins. Cities were destroyed, the economy had collapsed, millions were homeless, starvation was common, and for boys who'd gone through re-education, there was an additional complication: they'd changed. They saw their country differently now. They knew things about Germany's crimes that many Germans refused to accept. I found records of interviews conducted with repatriated POWs. American authorities wanted to know if the re-education program had lasting effects. The results were mixed but encouraging. Many former POWs who'd gone through re-education rejected attempts by ex-Nazis to recruit them. They supported democratic reforms. They advocated for facing Germany's past honestly. Some became teachers, bringing ideas about critical thinking and democracy into German schools. Others became politicians, journalists, activists working to build a democratic Germany. Karl Schneider, the teenager who'd resisted re-education at first, became one of these advocates. He taught history in West German schools. He made sure his students learned about the Holocaust, about Nazi crimes, about why democracy mattered. Hans Müller, who immigrated to America, became a vocal advocate for German-American friendship. He gave talks about his POW experience. He argued that America's treatment of German POWs, including re-education, had helped create the foundation for post-war alliance. But there were also boys who went back to Germany and immediately tried to forget everything they'd learned in America, who rejoined extremist groups, who claimed the re-education had been brainwashing. The re-education program's long-term success is hard to measure definitively, but historians generally agree that it contributed to West Germany's successful transformation into a stable democracy. Dr. Hoffman, the historian I spoke with earlier, put it this way: did re-education programs single-handedly denazify Germany? No, but they contributed. They gave thousands of young Germans exposure to democratic ideas. They planted seeds, and some of those seeds grew into the democratic institutions that made West Germany a success. I'm back at the field in Oklahoma, where Camp Elva once stood. The historical marker briefly mentions that it was a POW camp. It doesn't mention re-education. It doesn't mention the teenage prisoners. It doesn't mention the experiment that happened here. That bothers me, because I think this story has lessons that are still relevant. Today, we still deal with child soldiers. In Africa, in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, children are recruited or forced into military service. They're indoctrinated. They're traumatized. They commit violence. When these children are captured or rescued, what do we do with them? How do we help them? How do we reverse years of indoctrination and trauma? The American re-education program for German child POWs offers one model, not a perfect model, not one we should copy exactly, but one worth studying. It showed that education can work, that exposure to new ideas can change minds, that even deeply indoctrinated children can learn to think differently. It also showed the limitations, that not everyone can be reached, that re-education is ethically complex, that it requires enormous resources and commitment. I spoke with people who work with former child soldiers today. I asked them if they knew about the World War II re-education programs. Most didn't. This history has been largely forgotten. But when I told them about it, they were fascinated. One woman who runs a rehabilitation program for former child soldiers in Uganda said, "This is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to help kids unlearn violence, unlearn hate, learn to think for themselves." It's encouraging to know there's historical precedent. that it's been done before, that it can work. That's why I think this story matters, not just as history, but as a resource for understanding how to deal with child soldiers today. Before I finish, I want to tell you about one more person I found. His name is Otto Kramer. He's 96 years old. He lives in a small town in Germany. He was 15 when he was captured in 1944. He spent 2 years in Camp Concordia. I flew to Germany to interview him. I wanted to ask him directly, what was it like? Did the re-education program work? How did it affect your life? He invited me into his home. His walls are covered with photographs, his family, his career, his life. And in one corner, a small frame contains a photograph of Camp Concordia. Young men in POW uniforms standing in front of a barracks. Kramer is in the second row. He looks impossibly young. That was taken in 1945, he told me. I'd been in the camp for 6 months. I was learning English, reading books I'd never heard of, thinking thoughts I'd never been allowed to think. Do you think the re-education program worked on you? I asked. He smiled. I'm sitting here talking to an American journalist about my time as a Nazi prisoner. I'm telling you honestly that the Nazis were wrong, but I was wrong, that America gave me a second chance to become a better person. What do you think? It worked, I said. Yes, he agreed. It worked. Not immediately. Not easily, but yes, it worked. He showed me a box of letters he's kept for 75 years, letters he wrote home from the camp, letters his mother sent him, letters between him and American instructors after he was repatriated. These letters document my transformation, he said, from a boy who believed in Hitler to a man who believed in humanity. That transformation started in an American POW camp, in a re-education classroom, because someone decided I was worth educating instead of just punishing. I asked him the question I'd been wanting to ask everyone. Was it ethical for America to deliberately try to change what you believed? He thought for a long time. I was 15, he finally said. I'd been taught lies my entire life. I believed those lies completely. If America hadn't shown me the truth, if they'd just kept me prisoner and then sent me home still believing Nazi propaganda, what would my life have been? What kind of person would I have become? He paused. They didn't brainwash me. They unwashed the brains the Nazis had dirtied. They gave me the tools to think for myself, to question, to learn, to grow. Was that ethical? I think not doing it would have been unethical. I'm back in the United States now, back in my office, surrounded by documents and photographs and recordings. I've spent months researching this story. I've traveled thousands of miles. I've interviewed dozens of people. I've read hundreds of pages of documents. And here's what I've concluded. The American re-education program for German child POWs was an imperfect but important experiment. It demonstrated that even deeply indoctrinated children can be reached through education, that exposure to truth and critical thinking can overcome years of propaganda. It didn't work on everyone. It was ethically complicated. It made people uncomfortable then and makes people uncomfortable now. But for boys like Karl Schneider and Hans Müller and Otto Kramer, it was transformative. It gave them a second chance, a chance to become people they couldn't have become under Nazi ideology. America didn't just imprison German child soldiers, it educated them. It challenged them. It helped them become something different. Was it perfect? No. Was it simple? No. Was it worth it? For those boys, absolutely. The program officially ended in 1947, when the last German POWs were repatriated. The camps were dismantled. The classrooms were closed. The instructors went back to their universities, and the experiment was largely forgotten. But the boys who went through it didn't forget. They carried those lessons with them. Some became teachers. Some became advocates for democracy. Some immigrated to America. Some stayed in Germany and worked to build a better country. They went from fighting to learning, from soldiers to students, from enemies to, in some cases, allies. That transformation didn't happen automatically. It required commitment from American educators. It required courage from German boys willing to question everything they'd been taught. It required resources and time and patience. But it happened, and it mattered. Today the camps are gone, the barracks are demolished, the fences are removed. Most people don't know this history, but standing in that empty field in Oklahoma, I could still feel the weight of what happened there. Boys who'd been raised to hate learned to think, enemies learned to question, children learned to grow beyond what they'd been told to. That's the story of America's re-education camps for child POWs, a forgotten chapter of World War II, an uncomfortable experiment in changing minds, a reminder that education can be more powerful than imprisonment, and a lesson we still need today, as we figure out what to do with child soldiers, with indoctrinated youth, with kids who've been taught to hate. The answer isn't simple, it never is, but the experience of boys like Otto Kramer suggests that education, real education that teaches critical thinking rather than propaganda, can work. It worked 75 years ago in POW camps across America. Maybe it can work again. That's the story. That's what I found. That's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you for listening.